and good afternoon, everybody. It is a great honor for me to have a chance to talk about climate change. And as indicated by Joe in his initial presentation, climate change is a typical example of interdisciplinary issue. This is a truly global problem, and it needs to be addressed by the cooperation of all the countries across the border. But as a former negotiator, I have been also observing very much difficult realities on climate change negotiations. And the most recent example is COP29, which was just held in Azerbaijan, Baku, to discuss about financial assistance goals from developed to developing countries. And I have to say, I'm becoming more and more, how can I say, pessimistic about this issue, but nevertheless, I'd like to share my perspective with all of you, and I very much welcome your comments. And first of all, this is the excerpt of the outcome of so-called global stocktake in COP28. COP28 in 2023, which is held in Dubai. And as you may know, Paris Agreement has a process called Global Stocktake, or GST. And from 2023, every 5 years, parties are supposed to take stock of the progress towards global goal under the Paris Agreement, and where we are and where we are going, and what we need to do from now. So that is the purpose of this exercise. And naturally, developed countries would like to place strong emphasis on stronger ambition on mitigation. In other words, reduction of emissions. But on the other hand, developing countries have a strong interest to have more financial assistance from developed countries. So the outcome of the GST at COP28 has a mixture of these, how can I say, expectations. On one hand, on mitigation, in paragraph 28, this is a famous paragraph dealing with so-called energy transition. What needs to be done to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius goals and 2050 carbon neutrality, and to make those ambitions within reach. And as you can see in the chapeau paragraph, this paragraph calls on parties to contribute to the following global efforts in a nationally determined manner, taking into account Paris Agreement and their different national circumstances, pathways, and approaches. And the actions include, for example, tripling renewable energy capacity from now to 2030, and so doubling energy efficiency improvement from now to 2030, and also famous transition away from fossil fuels in the next 10 years, and also accelerating zero and low emission technologies, including renewable, nuclear, CCUS, and so forth. And it also recognizes the transitional fuels can play a role in facilitating energy transition while ensuring energy security. What is transitional fuels? That is natural gas. So it combines various voices of various parties. On one hand, say small island states strongly called for phasing out of fossil fuels. But on the other hand, resource-rich countries like Middle Eastern countries or Russia strongly demanded the maintenance of the fossil fuels in the energy mix. So therefore, it is the compromise text. And also, it called parties to submit next NDC, next national goals, national emission goals, in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius goals. So in terms of mitigation, it spells out various ambitious languages, but also it spells out very ambitious languages in terms of finance. For example, it says, in order to facilitate the achievement of NDCs by developing countries, you need 5.8, 5.9 trillion US dollars from now to 2030, just for achieving the current NDC by developing countries. And in order to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, then you need 4.3 trillion US dollars per year from now to 2030, and thereafter $5 trillion per year from 2030 to 2050. So this is an enormous bill, enormous price tag for achieving carbon neutrality. And looking at the actual emission pathways from 1990 up to 2023, the global CO2 emissions coming from energy sector has been increasing all the time, except for 2 particular years. That is 2009 at the time of the Lehman crisis and 2020 at the time of COVID-19. But all the other years, we have seen the increase of the CO2 emissions, energy-related CO2 emissions compared with the previous year. And in order to keep ourselves on track for 1.5 degree compatible pathway, we need to reduce global CO2 emissions 9.0% per annum every year from 2024 to 2030, and afterward 7.4% per annum from 2030 to 2035 in order to achieve compatible CO2 emission pathways for achieving 1.5 degrees Celsius goals. And well, to be frank, it is very much tall order. This is an understatement, and I just say it is impossible. But still, in the COP arena, this is the global standard for, say, sticking to 1.5 degrees Celsius goals. Then how about financial transfer from developed to developing countries? This is the trend of financial assistance from developed to developing countries from 2013 to 2022. And current target, a previous target before 2025 was $100 billion per annum financial transfer from developed to developing countries coming from bilateral, multilateral, and also private investment triggered by multilateral financial institutions. And for the first time, the amount has exceeded $100 billion in 2022. But up until then, the progress has been very, very slow. So, and with that background, we have come to COP29. And in COP29, the single biggest issue was to agree on the new collective quantitative goal. It is called NCQZ. That is a new financial assistance goals from developed to developing countries, replacing the current $100 billion, which is agreed back in 2009. So from the viewpoint of developing countries, this is the most important COP after 2015 when Paris Agreement was agreed. So naturally, for developing countries' perspective, the biggest motive for their participation in the climate negotiation is how much financial assistance they can get from developed countries. So this is the single biggest issue for them. For developed countries, they wanted to discuss more on mitigation or reduction of emissions. And they wanted to discuss on the next NDC, National Determined Contribution, and other issues to be submitted by all the parties in 2025, early this year, based on the outcome of the first GST Global Stocktake, which I have just presented right now. And then this was a big interest for developed countries. And naturally, the recent COP negotiations, developed countries have given top priority to 1.5 degrees Celsius goals and 2050 carbon neutrality, and have imposed on very ambitious mitigation goals for themselves. And but at the same time, they demanded the similar action from emerging and developing countries as well. And on the other hand, as I said repeatedly, the biggest incentive for developing countries to participate in the UN climate negotiation is to extract as much financial and technical assistance as possible from developed countries with historical responsibility for global warming from their perspective. And in the previous COPs, agreement have been reached between developed and developing countries based on a package somehow, balancing mitigation and finance. But of course, this balance has been, say, affected by the handling of the chair country. For example, in COP26, which was chaired by the UK, it was somehow the victory for developed countries because at that COP, for the first time, they made 1.5 degree Celsius goals as a de facto standard. And the COP27, which is held in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, developing countries, in a sense, made a victory because they got the in-principle agreement to establish so-called loss and damage fund. And in COP28, it was some sort of combination. On one hand, a developed country succeeded in including various ambitious mitigation languages for achieving 1.5 degree Celsius goals within reach, and also financial needs. A huge financial price tag was also included in that final document. And COP29, which will decide, or which decide on NCQG, is positioned as the most important COP for developing countries since the Paris Agreement, as I said. Then what was the outcome? Well, the most important element, NCQG, there are two kinds of figures were included. The first one, first bullet, calls on all stakeholders to work together to increase climate finance to developing countries to at least 1.3 trillion US dollars per year by 2035, 10 years from now, from all public and private sources. And actually, 1.3 trillion US dollars, this figure was already mentioned by developing countries, but they demanded 1.3 trillion US dollars from developed countries and from public money. And this language is calls on all stakeholders, not only developed, but also all the parties, and also from both public and private sources. So even though they are referring to 1.3 trillion US dollars, it is not at all satisfactory outcome for developing countries' perspectives. And the figure replacing 100 billion US dollars was presented in the next bullet. And they decides to extend the target referred to in part 53 of Edition 1 CP21, that is 100 billion US dollars per year, to set a climate action targets for developing countries of at least $300 billion US dollars per year by 2035. So tripling the financial assistance goals from now to 2035, with developed countries taking the lead. So for this figure, as I said, developing countries initially demanded 1.3 trillion US dollars. And in the course of negotiation, they have said, at least 500 trillion. And developed countries said, yeah, we can offer 200 billion US dollars. And in addition, a developed country argued that now the economic situation has changed from 1990s. So China and also oil producing countries should also join as a donor for this climate finance to developing countries. So they strongly insisted on the expansion of the donor base. And also they were very much specific about recipient of the climate finance, focusing on vulnerable countries like LDC, and also small island states. And naturally, developing countries did not like the idea of expanding donor base and did not like the idea of narrowing down the target of this climate finance. So in short, developed and developing countries were very much, the deep division between those two camps. So this was the final outcome of the COP29. And Indian delegation, after adoption of this language, made a very much passionate and also very much, the moving statement that they are not satisfied or they are very disappointed in the outcome, which they clearly brings out the unwillingness of the developed country parties to fulfill their historical responsibilities. And Indian delegation clearly said, we cannot accept it. And this comment was followed by Nigeria, Bolivia, Malawi, and those countries. So I have been observing this COP negotiation for many, many years, but such level of dissatisfaction from developing countries was very much rare. So that was very much impressive statement. But nevertheless, they preferred to reach an agreement because this year, 2025, we will have a new administration in the US. So perhaps the environment for international climate talk may not be, maybe less positive compared with 2024. So I think negotiators must have considered that rather than postponing the outcome, we should agree on something which is agreeable right now. So that was the outcome of COP29. Now, my assessment of COP29 is, first of all, developed countries and developing countries, both of them had a deep level of frustration. And then from developing countries' perspective, $300 billion US dollars was too small, too little. And from developed countries' perspective, they could not see any progress on mitigation agenda in COP29. But having said that, the prospect of achieving 300 billion US dollars is already very much challenging because with the economic situation in developed countries not necessarily good, it would be difficult to transfer such a large amount of money to developing countries from domestic political perspective. So this is the area where we need education because in many democratic countries, they need to get the support from voters about financial transfer from developed to developing countries. And in order to do so, the people need to raise their awareness about the potential danger of climate change, and education or information sharing is quite important. And also, at the very least, we cannot expect any climate finance from the US over the next 4 years, at least under the Trump administration. And it is not, possible that Japan and Europe will make up for this big vacuum. So the feasibility of 300 billion target, US dollar target, will further decline because of the, the absence of the US. And the situation where developing countries has accusation against developed countries, too low level of support, and also too slow, progress towards that even already low, financial assistance goals. So the acrimonious negotiation might continue in the coming decades based on my personal experience as a negotiator. And if the huge transfer of funds to developing countries does not materialize, then the ambition of energy transition incorporated in the GSD, such as tripling renewable and doubling energy efficiency, and also transition away from fossil fuels, could result in the pie in the sky. So it would be clear to everyone that already dead 1.5 degree is already even clearer. So this is a very much gloomy scenario, but looking at the real negotiation, I have to say this is the current situation. And also, we need to consider that climate change is a very much important issue, but it is a part of the broader geopolitical and geoeconomical problems. And Ukraine war has clearly elevated the priority of energy security in many countries. Cheap and abundant energy supply is the utmost priority for many countries. And China, India, while they are participating in climate change negotiation, but actually their coal consumption and coal power generation has hit record high in 2024. And even in developed countries, the soaring price of energy has become a big problem. For example, my country, Japan, while Japan is, targeting 2050 carbon neutrality, but currently government is providing huge amount of subsidy to gasoline for coping with high energy prices. So generally speaking, general public do not like the increasing energy prices. So this is another area where we need education. because the climate mitigation inherently increase your energy cost. So the willingness to pay is quite important for tackling climate change. Otherwise, the government cannot sustain such an ambitious mitigation policies. And clearly, there is some big rift between G7 and, for example, BRICS countries. And in G7 communique, there are repeated reference to 1.5 degrees Celsius goals or 2050 carbon neutrality, but there is no reference to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2050 carbon neutrality in the BRICS summit statement. And we have to say we are now in the fragmented world caused by Ukraine war, and this is going against the international genuine cooperation to prevent global warming, because global warming agenda became very much high in accordance with the end of the Cold War, right? But we are coming back to say the new type of Cold War. So this is not ideal situation. And Western countries, which have accumulated national wealth by relying on or squandering fossil fuels, but now they're opposing the fossil fuel-related investment in developing countries on the grounds of preventing global warming. And from developing countries' perspective, that could be regarded as, say, eco-colonialism or double standard. So it is quite ironical, but we need to understand their sentiment. And that kind of sentiment could be very much, utilized by China, because China is now challenging the existing world order, and they're claiming more multipolar world is important rather than one polar world imposed by US and Western countries. And China is playing a very much clever game in this current international climate politics. They're exporting very cheap solar panels and batteries and EVs to all over the countries. And they are even also exporting coal power plants to developing countries in needs. And they are procuring very much cheap Russian oil and gas by ground oil and gas pipeline. And also they are strengthening ties with oil producing countries amid anti-fossil fuel debate in the West. That was clearly observed in COP28 in Dubai. And as I said, if there is a frustration in developing countries about eco-colonialism by Western countries, then that could strengthen China's argument towards multipolar world. And the COP negotiation, COP language included tripling renewable energy capacity from now to 2030. But this is somehow the market guarantee for cheap Chinese product from now to 2030. So they can definitely make best use of this agreement. And there was a strong request from developed countries to China to join as a donor to climate finance, but they rejected that strong request. But they rather preferred bilateral assistance by BRI, Belt and Road Initiatives, and so on, and South-to-South cooperation. And that would be more beneficial for them to increase their influence in developing countries. And if Trump, and I do not say if, but it is definite, Trump administration would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, then China will be regarded as defender or guardian of multilateral framework for combating climate change, even though China is the biggest emitter. So I think China is playing very, very shrewd game based on their national interest, I think. So I have presented very much gloomy scenarios, but what I'd like to say here is climate change is still the global issue and a common threat facing humanity. Small economies and vulnerable countries, most notably small island states, are the victim of the global warming, even though they are not contributing to the accumulated CO2 emissions. So this is why global warming needs United Nations UN format to address. But the biggest problem, to my mind, is it is not easy to internalize the externalities, negative externality, that is global warming, how to agree on the cost burden sharing across all the countries. And benefits of each country's mitigation efforts are shared globally, but the economic cost of mitigation are borne by each country. So this is a perfect recipe for prisoner's dilemma. So this is the biggest issue, biggest reason why climate negotiation has been so, say, contentious, and it has made so little progress up to now. And in order to solve the problem of global warming, technological innovation and a change in people's awareness are essential. So in the past, energy transition was brought about by the development of innovative technologies and their massive cost reductions. So technology is a key. But also, we need to, say, raise the level of ambition and raise of the awareness of the people, because final consumers must be prepared to bear the increased cost of preventing global warming or mitigation. So education, again, will play a major role. And at the same time, it is important to drastically increase financial assistance to developing countries, which will account for the majority of the incremental CO2 emissions from now to 2030, 40, 50. COP29 in November 2024 revealed a deep rift between developed and developing countries over the new collective quantitative goal, NCQZ. And international political and economic situation becomes more chaotic, I have to say. The outcome of international efforts to prevent global warming will not allow optimism. That is my current summary. But I very much hope that my summary turns out to be wrong in coming years. But the climate change issue is very much affected by each person's perspective and also priority and also way of thinking and so on. So in this very much diverse format, I very much welcome your insights, and I very much welcome your counter argument to my gloomy summary. So, so with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Amra. Thank you very much, Jun. So we have time for some questions. We have about 10 minutes. So does anybody want to? Okay, one over there. Please wait for a microphone so you can be heard by others, but also online and in the recording.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Professor Arima. I mean, we can all see how you have changed from perhaps a more optimistic view to a pessimistic view now. In the current environment of the cost of living pressure everybody is facing, I can see the education being an integral part of perhaps people understanding why you need to pay, right? And the challenge now is the developed countries or those who have exploited and used fossil fuel in the past to get where they are now, in addition to exploiting the rest of the world, I should say. How will that, in the current environment, how will it change, or what strategies will you adopt to educate the public so that they are going to be willing and able to pay, so that the threat to humanity, in a way, can be reversed or at least be decelerated?
Thank you very much for very, very challenging question. And I wish I had a clear answer to that question, because this is a pertinent question in the last 20, 30 years. And when I was a negotiator, I had to fight with negotiators from developing countries, including India. And they always referred to historical responsibilities by developed countries. And after retirement from the government, I tend to agree with a lot of argument by developing countries because you're right, developed countries have been squandering fossil fuel resources, and they are now discouraging developing countries to use fossil fuels. But before demanding more ambitious actions to developing countries, they should bear more cost. But looking at for example, the outcome of the most recent European Parliament election, the Green parties have lost a lot of seats. And one of the reasons was, the Green Party's influence on cutting subsidies to diesel fuels in agricultural sectors. So final consumers do not like higher energy cost because energy is very much digressive. And whether you are rich or poor, you need to spend a certain amount of money for energy. And the lower your income level, the higher cost burden for energy. So, and so long as government needs to care about voters for the forthcoming elections, they tend to say, try to intervene in the pricing mechanism by providing subsidies. This is a typical example in Japan. And so I think, in order to cope with this situation, I think younger generation needs to understand the climate change is a truly global problems, and the vulnerable countries, including LDC and small island states, are suffering a lot. Some countries might be facing a risk of disappearing their territory, in particular Tuvalu or those countries. And that kind of, the education and information provision is quite important. But the biggest problem of that, say, solution is that will take time. Because the younger generation will, when the current younger generation come to the driving seat of the handling of the country, we need another 20, 30 years. So not only education, but also we need to spend more money for technology development. Because if technology is more advanced and then cost is more reduced, then the economic sacrifice for taking more ambitious mitigation actions will be less. So therefore, spending more money for innovation, next generation technologies is very much important. And the CO2 emission reduction is largely zero-sum game. But for innovation, perhaps that could be a plus-sum game. And there could be a lot of room for international collaboration. So therefore, I'm a strong advocate of international collaboration for innovative technologies, like next generation nuclear technologies or next generation, say, solar power technologies, including super, say, innovative space solar power or something like that. And ultimately, fusion technologies could be ultimate solution for many energy and climate problems. And though I'm tend to be pessimist for international politics for dealing with climate change, but I tend to be cautious optimist about human beings, how can I say, capacity to cope with various difficult problems by technology innovation. So let's hope that my, latter half, cautious optimist side will prevail.
I have two thoughts that immediately jumped to mind. The first is that the people who need the education are our 50 to 70-year-old people holding the wealth, not our children. Our children are very aware of climate change. But this older group of, even over 40 are extremely gullible people on the internet. And they are very prone to disinformation campaigns about climate change denial and that sort of thing. So I'm sure you're aware of it. I mean, I think the education should be them, but also we have foreign actors who are doing grey zone warfare through disinformation campaigns based around climate change denial. So I don't know, you have a comment on that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, and a very good question. And climate denier, it has a very much wide spectrum of definition. And one, extreme case is that people who do not believe in climate change at all. They do not believe in anthropogenic impact of the climate change or something. But there are people who are skeptical about very much expensive mitigation policies. And I regard myself as somehow the cautious skeptic about very much costly climate policies, because that will decrease sustainability of the government actions, and that will fail to get support from general public. So if you regard all of them as, say, climate denier, that will very much discourage very much sensible argument. We first should believe that the climate change problem exists, and that is largely caused by human being activities, anthropogenic activities. But at the same time, we need to have more pragmatic solution for cutting CO2 emissions. For example, if you deny fossil fuels right now, then that is not realistic looking at the current energy mix. So sometimes, climate deniers argument is too extreme. But on the other hand, at the same time, there's some environmental NGOs argument, stop fossil fuel now, or sue, lawsuit against oil and gas companies is another extreme to my mind. So you need to have more, how can I say, a middle ground approach. So that's my personal opinion. But you have a second question? No?
No, it was in two parts.
2 parts. Okay.
We can take one more question if there's one there. We have one question. If you can ask it reasonably quickly, and you're going to have to answer it reasonably quickly, please.
All right, Professor, thank you very much. I'm going to ask the question on the basis that you used to be a negotiator. Now, in a common, I'm not a law student, but what I do know is action, consequences, and responsibility. We do know that if you take historical data in terms of anthropogenic greenhouse emissions, we can clearly establish countries that have contributed more. Now, if these facts are there, and for example, coming from Africa, close to 1.3 billion people, recent statistics show that we contribute to less than 4% of the world global emission. But this is the continent that is going through all manner of impact, negative consequences of climate change, actually coming from the global warming. Now, my question is, would you push an agenda, if you have the means to do so, would you push an agenda that the world should establish a climate or global warming tribunal to deal with the countries that are more responsible for this current problem? Would you push for that agenda? Thank you.
Establishing a climate change tribunal is an interesting idea, but in order to establish such an international system, you need to have a consensus in the UN. And definitely developed countries will oppose to that kind of proposals. So your proposal will not fly. So that is my, very much boring answer to your question. Thank you.